This presentation is entitled, Is Your Genealogy Ever Completely Done? Our presenter is James Tanner. We appreciate his preparation and willingness to share his knowledge and experience with us. I'll now turn the time over to James.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, just as we began this, a little bit on the discussion before the presentation, we talked a lot about artificial intelligence, and that's going to be the topic of some of the presentations in the future. Obviously, how it works with genealogy or doesn't work with genealogy, depending on the case of how it looks. But we're going to talk about a subject that comes up almost too regularly from a lot of the people that I talk to. And that is mentioning that maybe they would like to look for some more interesting things about their family, and they come to me back and say something to the effect of, "Oh, I don't really need to do anything. Mine's all done." That comes primarily from people who have kind of a superficial look at the family search family tree and have had a lot of people in their family do genealogical research in the past, over the past, say, 100 and so years. I'm probably an extreme example of someone who could claim that my research would be all done because of the number of entries that were initially in the family search family tree. So we're going to kind of look at this kind of attitude towards completeness or doneness or whatever that you want to call it in genealogy and move right along. This is the introduction to that. This is called the Wheaton chessboard problem. It dates back into India in ancient times in India, when someone did some very important king or whatever in India wanted to give a benefit to someone who had done something for the country or whatever. But the real idea here is always the same. And in that case, the person said all he wanted was, and had a chessboard in front of him and said all he wanted was one grain of rice on the first, or one grain of whatever kind, wheat or grain, on the first square and two on the second square. And this chart on here illustrates the numbers that occur when you get into a exponential doubling of the first number, in this case from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, etc. And if you think about those numbers, maybe if you're at all into computers, you'll recognize those numbers immediately because they're the basic numbers for determining the amount of memory that anything has. And they started out with bytes, and then they moved into kilobytes, and then on up the line into gigabytes and terabytes and everything up at the end. By the way, when you get down to the end of the doubling here on the chessboard, the checkerboard here, you can see that the sum is a very large number, which is along the side of the chessboard over there. And I won't read that whole number. It doesn't need to be read, but it is essentially a large enough number that the total number of grains is this large number here, 18 trillion, 18 trillion, 446 quadrillion, 746, 44 trillion, 73 billion, 709 million, 551,615. And that's over 1.4 trillion metric tons, which is over 2,000 times the annual world production of wheat. And that's, you can see that just asking for what appeared to be a small quantity turns into a gigantic issue. And if you want to, if you haven't ever thought about it at all, perhaps you would like to see what happens when you have something that looks similar. Do you see any similarities between this pedigree chart and the chessboard? And does that give you any idea that if you went back on your pedigree, how many direct line ancestors you would end up with. And the answer is the same. It's 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 30, 264, 128, 256, 512, 1024, and so forth. That's how many back. You go that many generations back, and you literally have over 1,024 ancestors. And that doesn't take into account the fact that your ancestors may have had multiple marriages, and it's the one thing that it totally ignores when you look at it in that direct lineal sense, is that your ancestors, if it wouldn't be your ancestors if they didn't have children. And if they have children, they obviously have, in most of the world's history, up until the present time, they had a larger number of people being born than were dying. And so the number of people, descendancy grows faster than an exponential curve. It grows with an actual number of descendants, which can be, as you can see, going back even that many generations would be tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of descendants. The issue here is that the number doubles every generation. And this only applies to your direct line ancestors and not to your cousins and their descendants. When you begin to think of genealogy in terms of that kind of scope of the actual reality of how many people you're related to, you can begin to see that the main limitations are not any more people. There's no lack of people to do research for. The main limitations turn out to be record availability, the ability to identify these people because of the availability and the access to records. And so what we've experienced over the last 25 or 30 years or 40, we can extend it out to 50 years, is that our access to records has increased dramatically. Now, the numbers are hard to imagine, but that's really the process that's been happening. And so even though the actual fact of the existence of that many ancestors and that many people in the descendants of those people, of your ancestors, is a large number and technically turns astronomical, but the fact of it is that the limitation has always been access to records. And so as we work today, we find out that now records are coming into and being developed in the billions of records per year. There are so many records being created that the fact that number is unimaginably large, in a sense, you can actually see that there's a possibility of having an unlimited availability of research for genealogical purposes. So here's a number, for example. We'll throw out some numbers. Population of the Earth in 2023 is about 8.026 billion people. So there's 8.6 billion. When I deal in terabytes of memory, so the number of 8.6 billion doesn't really impress me that much, but I realize, of course, they're not all concentrated equally across the face of the earth. So we have places like New York and Tokyo and Mexico City and places like that out there in the world where they're piled on top of each other. But this is let's kind of give you a realistic idea of the total numbers. And let's jump back to the 1700s. Now, why did I choose 1700? I chose 1700 because before 1700, going back in time to 1600s, there are dramatically fewer records available for any part of the population of the world. So when if you were to do some sort of a curve of the number of records available, it would be drop off dramatically between 1801 and 1701 AD. So the population of the Earth at that point in time may be, in fact, an actual number of possible people that you could find back at 610 million people. So that really limits the total number of people that you can go back on direct lines going back to your ancestral lines, because they're going to end eventually, meaning any availability of records disappears, and you'll simply be into a process of copying information that's been generated by people who have no idea, if these people actually existed or not. And it's interesting to note that this total number of people is only, I say only, but it's about twice the current population of the United States. So you can see that having 610 people in a database, 610 million people in a database is entirely possible. That's in the 1700s. Now, just giving you some ideas of what we're talking about when we're talking about family search and some of the other websites. I didn't go into listing all of the different big websites out there. There's MyHeritage and Ancestry and Find My Past and a whole bunch of others. There are about 1.5 billion people in the family search family tree. Now, how many of those are duplicates? That's always something somebody raises. Yes, there are duplicates, but the number of people and records being added every year assures us that 1.5 billion is still a viable idea or number. So that's about twice the population of the Earth in 1700, but it's only 0.186% of the population of the Earth in 2023. So what does that really tell you? It tells you that there's a whole lot of people on the Earth that are there and available to research when you start at 1700 and come forward to the present. Because there's billions of people, billions. And the current population does not take into account all those people who have died between 1700 and the current and the present age, which makes the total number of available people for research and theoretically into the billions and billions. So just so it kind of puts it into a perspective. So this is what we're talking about in the 1700s, is that my 6th generation ancestors were born in the 1700s. That's 6 generations back for me. Of course, for my great-grandchildren, there's another 3 generations. It's going to be 9 or 10 generations back. So when you're talking about people who are alive today, children, small children who are alive today, or young children, that they have this already cushion, let's say, of people who have been born since, say, 1900. And the 1900 cushion, and now we have another cushion of those born since 2000, year 2000. And unless you happen to fall into some category of being adopted or foundling or some other, come from someplace where literally no one was keeping track of any records or things like that, you're finding your first level people back to the 2000 AD and back to, again, to the 20th century, to the 1900s, and then back into the 1800s is, for most people, fairly doable. And there are times when we reach an end of line where we cannot find additional records for a person. I'm dealing with one of those right now, which happened in Iowa in the late 1700s. The early 1800s and the late 1700s. And so by the time people started to get into different parts of the world, and especially in the United States, we're looking at 1700 as being kind of a watershed place. It's if you're going to push your genealogy and spend a lot of time going back before 1700, you really start to have to acquire a lot of skills with handwriting, with being able to read the handwriting, be able to recognize the records, just being able to find the records and know where additional places are to search. It all boils down to being significantly more difficult. And I'm not trying to persuade anyone anyway, the other, whatever people have different interests, and that's wonderful. But I am pointing out the fact that claiming that you can't do any more in your genealogy simply because one of two of your lines got back to where they're ending is a little bit disingenuous. So what does all this mean? What's the point of pointing out all of these tremendous numbers and all the things that are happening? The answer to that is fairly simple. None of us who are alive today will ever run out of people to add to our pedigree when we include in descendants. Now, when I say our pedigree, when we include, I'm being inclusive because I'm working on the family search family tree, and it is everybody's pedigree. So if you're working on the family search family tree, you're never going to run out of descendants and people to work with, because we're going to keep adding people and making more records available constantly. And that's a pretty fair and easy consideration. Now, I might make a side note here that has nothing at all to do with the present discussion that I'm having here with myself and of some people listening in. But this image, for example, is a Bing created image off of what's called Microsoft Image Creator. And if you were to look at it very closely, it's kind of, it looks a little weird, but it's only intended to be an image and to convey an idea. And so from that standpoint, it's perfectly usable. And the attraction for someone doing a presentation like this, for me, is that this is an absolute not copyrighted document. So I don't have to worry about anybody claiming that somehow or another they have a copyright to this artificial intelligence image. And it's a very interesting. So you might want to try to figure out which of the images on this presentation were created using the Microsoft Image Creator. If you need a little hint, you look in the lower left-hand corner, you'll see a little B, and that means Bing, and that means this picture of a road going off into the distance was created by the artificial intelligence image creator. Here's kind of my bottom line. My bottom line on suggesting to people for doing their own genealogy is to resist the temptation to jump back to research empty spaces on your pedigree. That doesn't mean you don't work back systematically, but when I say jump back, what I mean is don't pick up like a fan chart, for example, and go back to the last person in every line and start doing research on people back in the 1700s or 1800s. Work your way back on any line. Anytime you want to start to do descendancy research or want to continue doing research on a line, make sure that you have a very systematic and very well substantiated through sources connection back to the people that you're dealing with. Don't rely on what you see on a pedigree chart. Another point that I think is extremely important, and that is that you need to take control of your own research. And when you're taking control of your own research, what that means is you're not being driven by record matches and record hints, and you're not looking at a fan chart, and you're not looking at anything else. What it does is you're telling yourself you're achieving and studying and researching so that you feel very confident because of the sources and the information that you have, that the people that you're dealing with are adequately documented to the point where you can rely on them to have been real people. And I'm not going to get into the long discussion about changes on the family search family tree or whatever. If you want to get yourself out of that loop, and still have a way to advance in your genealogy. You can always jump to a program that has, from a desktop program to other large websites that have what you might call owned club family trees, where no one else has access. You have only access. You can use that as your vault or your collection point. And if you still are interested in working on the family tree, which I would strongly encourage because of its collaborative nature. And the point here, to understand that point, is extremely important, because if you're working on ancestry, for say, and I'll pick on ancestry for this one, and you're running your own private or even public tree, but no one else can make any changes. Well, how do you know you're correct? Who's correcting it? Who's looking at it and telling you whether you've done it right or not? Well, as a matter of fact, it's very possible that everything you have on your family tree, or a significant part of it, is not accurate. But if you go to the Family Search family tree, you're in a sense in the middle of probably some of the most, some skilled, I will make that point, some of the most skilled genealogists alive today, and they are going to be very, very vocal about whether or not the information you have there is correct or not. And so it's a different, of course, you may not want to live in that kind of an environment, but then again, you may end up doing genealogy and research back on lines that you're not really related to. So that kind of a trade-off. And I don't see that as a trade-off. Let me just state this for an absolute. I have been looking at pedigrees now for going on 40 years, or more than 40 years, going on 42 years right now. And in those 42 years of looking on at thousands and thousands of pedigrees, I have never found one that did not eventually end with a lack of a verifiable parent-child relationship. Every pedigree ends with an end, a dead end, where there is no verifiable parent-family-child relationship. Okay, the image on this in this slide is from Family Search, and it's back on one of my direct lines, the Morgan line. And looking at the dates here on these, you see that Gerard Morgan was born in 1772, died in 1814, and got married on the 10th of June of 1794. That's where he was supposedly married. And then Gerard Morgan, his father, was born in 1755, died in 1786, and he was married in 1772, and he lived in Goochland, Virginia. And then there's Dr. John Morgan, who's his father. And if you look at the numbers and you look at the places, it's all extremely logical. And it looks like that we have a real pedigree here, that we're actually going back in time to 1734 with Dr. John Morgan. Well, let's just look at one of these people here. Let's look at Dr. John Morgan and see what the sources he has. He has 3 marriage sources. And one, John Morgan, without any identification of virginal births and christenings for someone named Mary Morgan. So what's wrong here is that, if I go back for just a second, is there is no parent-child relationship between Gerard Morgan, who is 1755, born 1755, and Dr. John Morgan, who is born supposedly in 1734. If you look at now, once again, looking at the sources, this is all the sources. There's only 3 sources for that person so far that anybody's found. And he's been in the family tree for well over 100 years. And so far, no one's found any more records than these 3 mentions of a John Morgan, and nothing to tie him to anyone named Gerard Morgan, and nothing to show that he ever lived, or Gerard, the last Gerard Morgan there, ever lived in the place in Virginia where these records came from. And this person even if they did really exist at some point in time, if this is actually, if the John Morgan marriage records are actually somebody named Dr. John Morgan, if that's who they are, then there is no substantiation for any connection between Dr. John Morgan and Gerard Morgan, the last in the line of Gerard Morgans. By the way, there's 3 of them in a row. Okay, well, that's the demonstration of an end of line. And it's immaterial to the question of whether it is an end of line, because even if it has information in the family search family tree or in your own pedigree or in your own surveying book or your own file that you got from your grandmother or whatever it is, once you simply go up the lines and look to see if there is collaborative evidence, meaning collaborative records that substantiate a parent-child relationship, the first time there is no parent-child relationship substantiated by historical contemporary records, you're done. You're at the end of the line. Whether you want to go back further and make imaginary lines back into the Middle Ages and then back to Adam, that's up to you. But as far as the genealogy is concerned, you've reached that end of that particular line. Now, does that mean that his wife wouldn't be able to be found? Well, maybe not. So this may be the end of all those lines, all the possible lines from the 3 people that I showed here, the Sanderson, the Milton, the Foscues, everybody. But we don't know that. There may be some that go maybe 1 or 2 generations further back. So what does that mean? Well, that means that even though I said that we have this sort of unimaginably large number of people to do research for, we really have to we really run into the problem of having the record access and the resources to take it back any further. So what do? Well, when we come up against a dead end, we turn around. And in this case, we go back to the first substantiated person and make sure that their children are identified properly. And then we are on our way down to doing some descendancy research. So the point here is to always research from what you know to what you don't know. And if you don't know it, you're past the point where you can go. So that sort of ends that. And just another comment on the side here, the last couple of images we've seen are all artificial intelligence, computer-generated images. And most of the rest of the ones you'll see are going to be also. This is the rule. This is how it works. That doing genealogy is not working on a limited resource. It's not something that you're going to exhaust your supply. It's not like if you're out there trying to corner the market on some kind of collectible or something. It's not something that has a limited, finite number. The more people you add to your family tree, the more people there are who are yet to be discovered. It grows. It grows exponentially. And as it grows exponentially on all the descendants, it grows even faster than exponentially. So now you get into the situation. There was at the Roots Tech of this past February, March, Roots Tech, we had a app, a little View My Relatives on Roots Tech app. And I had, by the end of Roots Tech 2023, I had listed 48,958 cousins. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that of people who were alive online, I had nearly 50,000 people who I was related to, basically based on the family search family tree. And each one of those had parents and grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents. And somewhere along the line, our 2 lines crossed and we were relatives. So where they crossed, if I'd done the descendancy, I would have been able to do the descendancy down to these 40, 50, almost 50,000 cousins and determining who they were and essentially finding them down to the present. In other words, realistically into the 1900s and 1950s, because we have a 1950 census. And it's interesting too, because these relatives are from all over the world, not just in the United States, because I'm related to people all over the world. So I am technically never going to run out in my lifetime with people to research, not even just technically, practically speaking. Oh, here's the other possibility. I have 15,184 DNA matches from my heritage, and I have another 34,798 matches on Ancestry. So here's close to another 50,000 or more people that I not only am related to as cousins through the family search family tree, which may or may not be correct or accurate, but I have DNA matches that say that I have 50,000 people I'm related to out there. And the answer to this question is the only reason you don't know that you have 50,000 or 100,000 or whatever people that you're related to that are walking around on the face of the earth today is because you haven't done enough genealogy, or your family hasn't done enough genealogy, and you haven't taken enough two DNA tests. So if you haven't taken the DNA tests and you haven't done a significant amount of and put a lot of information into online family trees, you will not have this kind of matches. And so it won't be there. So it'll appear to you that you don't have that much to do because you're not related to that many people. And the answer is you're related to just as many people as I or anyone else. And that's just the way the world is put together. And so there's no possibility that I could work through all of these 50,000 people and determine how I was related to all of them. Now, that the interesting thing about these large programs, however, particularly Ancestry and MyHeritage, is that they are doing that job for me. They're already telling me how I'm related. They're already creating trees, family trees, from the data that they have online that shows me who my common ancestors are, and they automatically give me openings to do a huge amount of genealogical research, in addition to simply looking at this as being interesting that there's that many people out there. Okay, so here's the ultimate question. What do I do with all of those many, many people that I'm related to, either through the family tree or through all these other DNA, or through relatives around me, or through relatives at RootsTech, or whichever program it is that pulls up this huge pool of people that I'm related. The fact of the existence here is depends on where you live and how long your family has lived in that area. But what happens is the same thing that happened. I was in a small group of people and we all had our phones, and somebody said, well, let's see if we're related. So they pull out their phones and they go to the family search program and go into familysearch.org. And all of these people happen to have ancestors on the family search family tree. And so in a matter of a few seconds, there were 15 people or so in this group. And it turns out I was related to at least 6 or 8 of them. So it just out of a fairly random group of people. And that's, of course, because I live in Utah. My ancestors lived in Utah. My ancestors lived in Arizona. My ancestors lived, in a concentrated area. But that doesn't mean that that's not going to happen on a worldwide basis, because given the number of people. Now, what happens if you find yourself in the category of being adopted or a foundling, meaning you don't know who your bloodline parents are? Well, DNA testing will likely at this point, with the numbers of people that are now involved in having taken DNA tests, using the top 2 programs, which are Ancestry and MyHeritage, or both together, it's very likely, and we find stories of people finding their bloodline ancestors constantly. It's something that's just happening every day today. It's not a new experience. It's nothing that occasionally when someone famous or newsworthy finds a unknown ancestor, then it gets back in the news. So what if you're just getting started? What if you have just a very, very few names and you really don't know that much about your family, and you are involved in and you're just barely, you don't really know exactly where who your ancestors are, and you don't all know all this stuff, and you can't start quoting numbers like I've just quoted, that you have 50,000 here and 100,000 and 1 million and all that. Well, the answer is your relatives are all there. Just because you don't know who they are, that doesn't mean that you don't have relatives. Even if you were an only child, you still had 2 parents, and they still had 4 grandparents. You still have 4 grandparents, and so forth. It's nothing to do with the size of your family. All that has to do with is how many people you have to account for. In other words, back in the early days of doing genealogical research, it was very, very common for people to research only their surname line, or what you would call the bloodline, and only of the paternal bloodline. So what you would get in many of the old genealogies, of which I've seen thousands, is you would get all the Tanners going back, but you would have no research ever having been done on any of the spouses, any of the wives to the Tanners. And so you would have all the way back to 1700s with the Tanners, and all of the wife lines were basically non-existent. Now, as time goes on, of course, that has been rectified. There's now today, all of those lines, all those what you might call other lines through the maternal lines, have all been researched. And so there's a huge number of people on the family tree, for example, that are now, just from the Tanners, have a tremendously large number of people. So here's an interesting question that's always given to me, and that is, how many people do you have in your family tree? And my answer is, well, I really don't know, but it's close to 1.5 billion. In other words, I view the fact that I'm probably related to nearly everybody that's been constructed in the family tree. Anybody that's been connected to the family tree will probably be connected. And you say, well, that's ridiculous, because how would you be related to somebody in Tonga or Africa or where else? As a matter of fact, on the DNA results from my DNA test, the countries listed, there are 30 or 40 different countries listed where I have DNA matches. Not limited to Western Europe, not limited to the British Isles, not limited to Denmark, where I have researched ancestors, or the Netherlands, but all over the world. And so conceptually, it's very difficult for me to try to limit my understanding of who I'm related to some artificial grouping of people that cuts off everybody else that I'm actually related to. It may not be conceptually and psychologically, it may create some problems for a lot of people that they find out. So what's the way you can get started on that is to take more than one DNA test. And there's 2 companies that have sufficiently large online databases of records and family trees to be taken seriously, and that is Ancestry and MyHeritage. There are some very good DNA companies out there, countries out there that are remarkable companies for giving you detailed information about your own DNA. But without the framework of the family trees and the availability of the research and the records, those other companies are not going to give you a lot of information about your ancestry. So this has been said many times in the last at various presentations and around. It's quite well known about this particular point that it's really a race down to the two, ancestry and my heritage, and why not just take both? So that's where it's at right now. And let's suppose that you really are a person who does not know their bloodline at all, and you are a foundling, or you have one in your family in a very close proximity. Your parents, your grandparents, whoever, are people who were abandoned or adopted, and you never knew who their parents were. And I'm working on one of those right now, of somebody who had a relationship, got married to someone who abandoned them almost immediately, and they've never been able to identify the person who abandoned the husband who walked away. And this is close enough in time and close enough in relationship through generations that a DNA would be very helpful. DNA would help the family sort out who was possible historically. And looking at research, there's a number of people that could be matches, but it's DNA that helps you identify that person. And I've given and will give other presentations showing how that works. I'm not going to get into it today so much, but by having all of these matches and these people, you find people that you really have never heard of. And there are people whose surnames do not appear in any of your records. And those are the people that you need to identify and contact and try to determine how, in fact, you're related. You may find out that the common ancestor is this person that you cannot or could not identify, meaning your bloodline ancestor. Okay, so here's 3 ways to extend your present research. First of all, you can go through any existing genealogy that you have, any existing records that you have, and correct and document the existing entries. This is what I started going on 42 years ago. Spent the first 15 or so years just simply determining where and how I was related to all these people, and found out that a significant amount of the information was duplicative, but a significant amount of it was not correct, and that a lot of the information had lines in my family that I was not particularly related to. It simply had records that would have been extracted because of having the same surname. So that's one of the things. But the advantage we have today is that with the trees like Family Search Family Tree, that's not going to take as long a time, and take considerably less time. Look for missing children. If your families are out there, then there could be children missing. There's gaps in the number of children, and if there's a long gap of more than a year or two between 2 children born in a family, then it's very, very likely that there was a missing child. Or begin descendancy research. And descendancy research can be done from back even just the first generation. The first descendancy research you could do would be to your brothers and sisters. Of course, you know that, but you can go back to your first cousins, which are the people, your parents' children and your parents' siblings and their children, and then so forth. As you move back, identifying all these people, then you'll find out that you really are involved in what seems like an endless task of identifying people, which is what the whole point of this presentation is about. And if it's possible, obviously some people resist mightily the idea of taking a DNA test today, or even becoming involved in genealogy. But if it's possible for you to do that, so you're looking at those people around you and finding your relatives is something that you can do, then that's who you should do and focus on and contact these people. One of the questions I always ask as I go on the Family Search Family Tree, for example, is you'll see sources added by a whole number of individuals. And not all of them will be easily identified, but the idea with the Family Search Family Tree is that you can click on their name and send them a message through the Family Search Family Tree, through Family Search. Now some won't reply, but others may. And the basic question is, how are we related? And if you begin to identify this, you may very well find that other people have done the research already, finding the person the elusive person that you have never been able to identify. So this is one way to proceed. So what you want to do and you want to make sure is that you document your existing relatives. And that is to make sure that everybody that you have is as thoroughly documented as is possible. And that means finding every record on every website and every paper record that you're able to find about the people. And if you run out of sources to look at, a lot of people get stuck in what I call the BMD census syndrome. And what that means is that they identify some birth, marriage, and death records, and they pick up some census records, but that's it. They don't look for any other records because A, they don't know they exist, and B, they wouldn't know how to find them. So that's basically what we do, what people like me do who work at the BYU Family History Library or in other places, is to sit down and suggest, well, here's some more places you can look, or here's some more information that you probably can get from other sources. So these are the kinds of things that can happen. So always make sure that you're researching in reality and not in fantasy. When I give these examples, these are examples that come straight out of the Family Search Family Tree. I don't create this. It's not an artificial intelligence creation. This is the actual record in the tree. So here's Christopher Green, and I would say the amazing Grace Stainrod, who, according to the Family Search Family Tree, had 51 children. And amazingly, she had the first 3 in the same year. So she had sets of triplets who she gave the exact same name to, which was pretty hard to keep track of her triplets in the 1560s because she called them all Henry Green. And they all died the same year, which is a tragedy. So what we've got here is of course, the next one, she had quadruplets, all born the same year, and they never died. So, maybe that offset the triplets who died, but you can begin to see that there's a lot of work to be done on the Family Search Family Tree, and that's another way. And identifying all of these people, by the way, and determining which one is correct person, if there is a correct person, because they are probably duplicate people, will assist you, because as you clean that up, then you're going to have people that you can actually rely on, assuming that Christopher Green and Grace Stainrod are actual people. And then you could use that for your descendancy research. So everything you do to help preserve and correct information in the Family Search Family Tree generally ends up creating opportunities for more research. Here's another way to go on it. This way is to make sure that you continue to learn about new resources, because new resources are popping up all the time. And if you, for example, we've got a few people out there, and if as you're watching this or listening to this presentation, my question is, do you know about the dp.la? That's the actual address, dp.la, the Digital Public Library of America. Right now it has 47 million plus images, text, videos, and sounds, including a substantial genealogical collection. A great place to look. And maybe you've never heard of it, or maybe you have, but I can probably throw out other large collections of records that you perhaps have never run across yet. And by the way, I run across sources for information that I had no idea existed. even after the years of being online and spending virtually full time doing research and finding records. So I would also suggest that you learn how to do genealogical research. And the way to do that is to always keep learning, always learn more than you knew yesterday. Make sure that you follow up any question. And I do this by helping people. The more people I help, the more questions I have to resolve, the more issues that they give to me to do some research on. It helps me to learn about new resources or more specific records that are available in specific areas. And so basically, the more I do, the more that I help people, the more I learn. So that's exactly what's going on. So keep learning and keep on working. That's how we do it. We just never give up. Don't ever give up and say, it's too much, I can't do it, I don't know how to do this. It's all incremental. It's all something that you can handle if you take it in relatively small bites, and you can, as they say, you can eat an elephant. In fact, there's some guy in Australia that I read about a few years ago that sat down and ate an entire car. I can't mention that, but he did. So there are things you can do that seem impossible. So thanks for watching, and see if you can guess how many of the images on this particular presentation were generated by artificial intelligence and which ones weren't. And as kind of a closing note, I will not ever use an artificial intelligence for my final slide. These are always my photographs.